Well, I guess they really want us to stay on time, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good almost afternoon, everyone. I'm Viet Nguyen. I am the technical director for the HL7 Da Vinci Project. I'm a physician informaticist. I've been working in interoperability for about 15 years and FHIR for about the past 4 or so. So the goal in this session is to introduce those of you who aren't familiar with Da Vinci, and those who are familiar to give you an update. So how many folks in here have watched a Da Vinci webinar and gotten a kind of an overall? Okay, so there's still work to be done to educate folks about what we do in Da Vinci. We like to put up this slide because we put it up pretty much every Da Vinci meeting. It's the ANSI antitrust statement that HL7 follows.
I can't get the answer to that on Apple Watch.
All right. I don't know why my watch does that, but and so we remind the folks on the call that what we're doing is for the greater good, and that we want to build products and specifications that can benefit patients, providers, and payers. And so we strictly ask folks not to share things that are proprietary so that we can avoid any antitrust issues. So I put up this Venn diagram because it's kind of the way I look at the ecosystem today and the healthcare market, and that organizations adopt technologies to meet needs and drivers. And the 3 primary drivers that I see, and there are probably others, I'm sure, are regulations such as meaningful use and now the NPRMs that are going to be rules eventually, managing cost constraints so that we don't have ballooning costs in healthcare, and always should be improving patient outcomes and patient health. Unfortunately, in the past, it seems like it starts in that order, and that patient care isn't always put at the highest priority like it should be. But value-based care, and there are lots of different definitions of value-based care, is really trying to bring those all together so that we can control costs and we can improve patient care, but sometimes there's a role for regulation in trying to move us towards that. And the folks of Da Vinci are really focused on how do we build this future ecosystem to support value-based care while recognizing that we're in a transition. And the way we've done that is to bring together these disparate stakeholder communities to work together. And I think the thing that surprises folks the most is that you managed to get a whole bunch of payers in the room to agree to do something that's the same. And the answer is yes. And actually, they work really well together. And there's a kind of healthy competition to be the first to demonstrate the things that we're developing in Da Vinci. So this is just a diagram to kind of show that fee-for-service isn't going away anytime soon, but we're in a transition. And so ultimately, the whole, as was mentioned earlier, or in one of the discussions, that the whole health IT ecosystem is evolving. And with any ecosystem, different parts of the ecosystem evolve at different rates. And so we want to try to accelerate everyone's adoption of FHIR, but that takes time. So Da Vinci was officially formed actually just barely a year ago. It was an idea maybe 18 months ago. And so in this time, we've already developed we've developed 8 implementation guides and balloted 4 of them, and created a number of reference implementations to demonstrate what's being shown in these implementation guides. And we have a number of additional implementation guides and reference implementations, and I'll show you a schedule where we're headed this year. So this is the all-in-one slide for Da Vinci, and this will be in the slide deck, so that'll be posted. And essentially, it summarizes that we recognize the shift to value-based care. We want to develop solutions that can be adopted across the ecosystem by all the payers, as opposed to them developing one-off solutions. And we do that by bringing together the community of providers, payers, and vendors to identify the use cases that are most important to them, both financially and from a regulatory standpoint, as well as from a burden standpoint. And then we take those and then we develop implementation guides and reference implementations based on them. So we have our founding members were the 4 major EHRs. We had 16 payers, 9 health IT vendors, a dozen or so providers, and 14 use cases. And we thought we'd be doing about 2 or 3 use cases a year, and right now we have like 8 use cases in flight. So these are a number of our premier members and as well as associates. And there's a pretty good representation across the payer and provider and vendor community. We have sponsors as well, and we have sponsored roles as well, where our premier members can bring in additional members that are sponsored. So they bring in providers that work in their community. And then we have contributors who bring in clinical expertise, and then we partner with HIMSS and NCQA in order to broaden the community and get a broader input from the community and help promote them as well as what we're doing. So people ask, what do you guys do in Da Vinci? And this is we use as a sample timeline, because what we do is we create implementation guides and reference implementations. And it begins upstream after our members identify specific use cases, or at least kind of general domains of use case that they want to focus on. We bring them together and try to develop some scope around this. Because if you don't develop scope, you guys have worked in healthcare, everything fits in somewhere. So we have to scope it so that we can achieve something that's implementable. And once we have a scope, we then put it into the HL7 process. And that means we write a project scope statement, we find an HL7 work group to sponsor the work, we have them approve it, and then we kick it off with project calls. So the first part where the Da Vinci members give a lot of input, it's actually the smallest part of this whole path. Because once it's in the HL7 process, it's all public. So if you wanted to get involved, and we get this question all the time, how do I get involved in Da Vinci? We say, look at our implementation guides, or look at the projects that we're working on. Find the ones that are most important and most salient, and the ones you think your organization can contribute the most to, and start joining the use case calls. In the use case calls, we then start to further flesh out clinical scenarios or administrative scenarios, because we try to look for lower P patterns, not FHIR patterns, but patterns of common approaches and common clinical scenarios. And then using those, we look at what's the current state, how data is shared today, what are those data elements that are being shared, what are the requirements. And then from there, we start to develop the FHIR implementation guides to say, if you need, everybody needs, a patient demographics. So we identify, we carry patient demographics with US core patient resource or patient profile. So we then define the implementation guide, the transactions that we use. If we have to come up with new operations for certain things, like we did for quality measures, we define those. And at the same time, or just slightly after, we start building a reference implementation. And this has actually been an interesting challenge for us, because you want to build a reference implementation that's representative of the IG, but much of what we're doing in the IG is fairly new. So we want to have enough lead time to have some assurance that what we build in the reference implementation doesn't have to be ripped out and redone. But the reference implementation is really useful because it then gives the developers and a sense of what the code would look like. And we share that on GitHub, and then we also have a partnership with the Health Services Platform Consortium to host the reference implementation so that developers can see it working, we can demonstrate it to folks, and then we can actually use it in connectathons as well. And throughout the process, we work with the work groups, and ultimately we determine the best time to try to put it into ballot for the broader community to comment on and go through the whole balloting process. So this is just a screenshot of our first 2 balloted implementation guides, our coverage requirements discovery and the data exchange for quality measures. We also balloted documentation templates and payer rules back in May, as well as the second ballot of the data exchange for quality measures. And what we're learning is that often what we do is create frameworks. And so the data exchange for quality measures, is, as I'll show you, is a framework for sharing quality measures, but we know that there are different types of quality measures. And so we try to develop examples so that developers, if they have a screening quality measure that's an example, they could hopefully apply that to other screening measures and help them see the pattern. So our ultimate goal is to have our members and others in the community actually implement these implementation guides. And this is just a very high-level architecture view of where Da Vinci works, which is really in the center. We're defining what happens at the FHIR endpoints and what's being exchanged between payers and providers. But we recognize that in a real implementation, you may have translation services that translate it to whatever back-end databases and operations that you would have. But if you think about when we do the reference implementation, these would be HSPC FHIR sandboxes that we use to represent the FHIR servers. So because we're part of the HL7 community, we participate in the Connectathons. We think that's an important part of FHIR, and we agree with the rest of the community in that way. And so, we participate in the Connectathons, and we use those opportunities to test out the implementation guide. But we also had a great opportunity at HIMSS this year in the interoperability showcase to try to put it all together. And so we did this year, and we look to do actually even a bigger version next year. But what we did is we created a clinical story, because if you've gone to HIMSS, there are a lot of executives and doctors, and they're not down in the weeds with the data and interoperability. So we wanted to show them what it means to do FHIR and in the payer-provider space. So we created a clinical scenario of a lady, Dara, who's 78 years old. She is seen by her primary care provider and is referred to a cardiologist. And one of the challenges that we have if you're a provider is figuring out who's on a patient's in-network and are they available. And so using the FHIR scheduling API, we were able to show how we could have a payer app, like in a patient portal, be able to identify a provider, look into one of the EHRs for open slots, and then book a patient for that slot and show how it was done. And that was done with the Cerner EHR. And what we did in this interoperability showcase is that we actually had 12 providers, and every 2 hours we swapped out the payers and the provider, the payers in the scenarios, so that you could see that they had to use the same standard, which was a nice proof point that we weren't doing point-to-point integrations. And so, we booked the patient to the cardiologist, and then you would imagine the patient goes to see the cardiologist, and one of the big challenges we have when you see a new patient, often all you have is the clinical information the patient writes in their intake form. And we've all filled out those intake forms, right? And so if you're lucky as a specialist, you might have gotten some notes sent to you in advance, but chances are you didn't. And so we were thinking, how do we improve the quality and content of the information, the clinical information that's available to providers and patients for clinical decision making, so that it's as complete as possible. And when we think about that first encounter and what's just available to the patient, we also realize, well, payers have a ton of clinical information. They've known for at least the duration the patient has been one of their covered members, who they've seen, what labs have been done, imaging studies. They might have something as basic as a claim, so they just know it was done, but often a lot of the payers actually have the specific clinical information as well. And so we use an example of this patient coming to see a specialist for the first time, and we use CDS hooks. You open the chart, it goes out to a payer CDS service. We had 4 or 5 payers create the CDS service and retrieve the allergies, the conditions, a medication statement, and document reference, and then write them back into the EHR. And if you can imagine how useful that is, I mean, you're really saving time and delays in patient care when you can provide this information for providers. And then we have a patient getting admitted to the hospital and discharged on oxygen. And so we looked at one of the big burdens for providers nowadays is around prior authorization. And so we demonstrated what we show as the first step in the prior authorization is, do I need one? And so that interaction demonstrated how we use the coverage requirements discovery implementation guide, and Rush Medical, using the Epic system, demonstrated how you could order oxygen, and it would then trigger a CDS hook, go out to one of 5 or 6 payers, and would return a card. Either initially it was just an information card, but actually one of the payers even went as far as creating a simple Smart on FHIR app using that card. So that was really useful. And then we have the patient going home, and they needed to have a medication reconciliation, which is a HEDIS requirement. And one of the challenges with this particular quality measure is you only have 30 days from the time a patient gets discharged until the time you've run out of time to get this medication reconciliation. And in today's world, it's very labor intensive to be notified about the discharge, get the facts potentially of the medication list, provide that to the follow-up physicians or provider, and then get them to do the reconciliation. And so because of that, that time requirement that typically is also dependent on the revenue cycle today, we demonstrated that you could, when you do the medication reconciliation in the EHRs, which is supported by all the major EHRs, you would have a functionality to send the attestation to the payer to close that gap and complete that quality measure. So this is just a good example of how we really want to make all these implementation guides real. This is we jokingly call the secret decoder ring to help folks understand our relationship with Karen and where we're working in alignment so that we're developing reusable tools, especially when it comes to getting information out of payer systems. You don't want to, if you're getting information out, whether it goes to the patient or goes to another provider, is more about what they're permitted to see than it is how you pull it out. So, so what we're going to go through is relatively high-speed list of our use cases. The way to think about the Da Vinci use cases as they stand today is in three kind of major work streams. One is around what we're calling quality and process improvement. The next one is around clinical data exchange, and the last one is kind of benefit identification and burden reduction. The first set is around things that started out with data with quality measures. And we created our 30-day MedRec example. We just validated the deep vein thrombosis and colorectal screening as additional examples of quality measures. But we just started in a working meeting a couple of weeks ago, some discussions around gaps in care. And one of the things that the group concluded was most gaps in care can be represented much like you represent quality measures. But the challenge that gaps in care also does is that how you send it. How do you send a set of gaps in care? It's not just payers' gaps in care. It might be gaps defined by quality measures. It might be gaps defined by even the hospital system a provider is in because they've selected a certain set of MIPS measures for that given provider. And then along with that is how do you identify that the patient is, some upcoming ones is how do you identify a patient's in a risk-based contract? And then how do you make sure that there's proper documentation when there is a patient with a chronic condition so you can do risk adjustments because that affects the revenue cycle. The middle box is actually the biggest probably box because this is where most of what we spend our time in terms of how do we share clinical information between payers and providers and providers, and then how can we do alerting and how can we provide information so that you can direct care. And then finally, the last one is around burden reduction and prior authorization, and I'll walk through these a little bit more. So in terms of performance improvement, there's a drive right now to evolve the ecosystem around quality measures. Today, there's written quality measures, there's registries, there's ECQMs, there's HQMF, and if I'm using these acronyms, there's a lot of acronyms in the quality measure space. The challenge is that they're written in different ways. There are a lot of human effort to abstract data from the chart. There's efforts that have to check eligibility, that the patient belongs in a certain quality measure, so there's vendors involved. And then there's all the reporting process. And one of the things that's a problem too is that the way we do quality measures today, it really doesn't, it's helping us toward a better learning health system, but often isn't information early enough for you to change behavior. Because if you found out how you did something a year ago, well, that doesn't help me that much. So what's being envisioned in FHIR is a set of implementation guides around quality measures, recognizing that on the left-hand side are where the measure authorers are, and they would define quality measures as a measure resource. And within that measure resource is CQL, or clinical quality language, that defines the patient population and the numerator and denominator, as well as defining what are the FHIR resources and the elements within the FHIR resource that could be used to report on that measure. The benefit of this is that you're defining everything you need to do on the front end with this measure resource and specific instances. So for our examples, we have a MRP measure instance, we have a VTE, or venous thromboembolism measure instance, and we have a colorectal cancer screening that represents HEDIS or CMS's representation of those measures in CQL. Along with that, we use an implementation called QI Core, or Quality Information, the core profiles. So they take the US core profiles as well as other FHIR resources and define in a profile the specific requirements, just like you would any profile, in order to satisfy quality measures. And then finally, we have the DEQM, which defines how do you exchange that information between what we call a producer, and we call them producers because they're the primary data creators, the clinicians or the labs or the imaging centers that generate information, with consumers, which may be a payer or a registry or some other organization. And then finally, we define the interactions of how do you either push the data or pull the data from producers, between producers and consumers, and finally send reports, aggregated reports to a measure authority. So what we did with the data exchange for quality measures is really take three operations, and there's a fourth one too, that you can query a source for their data requirements for a specific measure, but we define how you can do a submit data. So that's what we did in medication reconciliation. You push the data as soon as it's created. You could also use a collect measure data. So we did this in colon cancer, where a payer has a list of patients and they want to query a provider who you have expected to have the attribution for these patients, and run the CQL using a reference, the HSPC sandbox with the CQF ruler, which is a CQL engine, and collect that data and then packages up in a measure report. We also have represented in the reference implementation what we kind of do today, which is a provider gets a spreadsheet. These are the patients that are attributed to you. Please send us the colon cancer data or screening data for these patients. And so we show how you could select patients and then generate that measure report and send it. But ultimately, we think we could do a subscribe method, either periodically or when data is created, to collect data in as real time as possible. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and for those who are in this measure space, I'd recommend joining us at the Digital Quality Summit in July in Boston, where there's actually 2 tracks on FHIR. I'm going to be leading one, and we're going to go more deeply into this ecosystem. So the second set is benefit identification and burden reduction. So I talked about this first one, this coverage requirements discovery. So what it does is it answers the question, do I need a prior authorization? If the answer is no, great. If the answer is yes, we at least send a simple CDS hooks card, that informational card, that tells you what information you need to collect, because often providers don't know that unless they go to a website. So this is trying to intervene within workflow in a helpful way. So at first, you give them some information. That's okay, that's not bad. But that's still not quite enough. And so we can help them some more by giving them or letting them know what documentation they actually need to submit. So this next use case is the next step in the process. I know I need a prior authorization. The payer has some rules around what I need to document. Tell me that in advance. So the documentation templates and coverage rules uses CDS hooks, and what comes back from the payer based on what's being ordered is a CQL that defines what data is required, and so that CQL is then run on the EHR to pull data. So if I need the simplest example is if you need oxygen, that's what you order and you have a prior auth, chances are the payer wants a pulse oximetry. So if you know you want a pulse oximetry, you put it into the CQL, it pulls the pulse oximetry, and then as part of the process, you generate a questionnaire resource. And that questionnaire is kind of question and answer, and you pre-populate that. And then you present that to the provider at the time of ordering in a Smart on Fire app. And that way, anything that the EHR already has that's structured and computable has been pre-populated. And then whatever is necessary for like narrative, the provider hopefully has to fill out fewer forms. Does that make sense? So that's part of an effort to do some reduction in burden. But still, that's not quite enough. But so this is just a diagram of the ordering. You do an order review, initiates a CDS service. You would have a library of items that can be that have been predefined in terms of the data requirements. You return that as a CQL and a questionnaire resource, and then the user completes it. And the idea is once they complete that interaction, they could save it if this is where you stop, and it gets ideally written back into the EHR as a document reference or some record of that interaction that you collected the information. But ideally, you also then send it to the next step, which is send it to the payer for prior authorization. And so this is one that we're working on actively that we hope to have in ballot in September. But the idea here is that you gather all that information. You also then add a fire claim resource. You do a submit. It goes to a fire endpoint that does an operation on that bundle. And within the black box of that claim, of that endpoint, there's a conversion from the fire resources, one into 278, and then the clinical data as binary into 275. And so there's been this question asked every session so far this morning is about where does X12 fit in here? We're actually working with X12, and we have a couple of folks who are X12 members and HL7 members who are working on the mapping for the 278 and what fire elements would be needed to go into the 278. That mapping will be X12's proprietary information, but what we do in Da Vinci will be to define what happens here at this layer. And the idea then is you send it across because it's a HIPAA mandated transaction as 278, 275, but if you have a binary, you can recreate the original fire resources, and then the payer system would have that clinical data. So it's a kind of version of attachments, but I'm using that word carefully. It's little a attachments. So this is, we think, a way where the payers would now have this clinical information and ideally process that and be able to return a prior authorization response. Hopefully synchronously, but depending on the complexity of what's being asked, maybe it might be pended. So we're working through these different examples now. So this is where you put it all together. You ask whether or not you need prior authorization through using coverage requirements discovery. You represent documentation requirements for the provider using the DTR implementation guide. Then you package it all up using the implementation guide we're developing around prior auth. And we think that this will go a long ways to helping reduce the burden of providers and hopefully streamline prior authorization. And I think over time, as we get more and more and more of these, there's a sense that payers know what things that they can prior auth pretty quickly, and we lower the number of things that need to be pended. So the health record exchange. So we described early on, a good example for payers to providers. Another thing that payers ask for all the time is clinical data from providers. A really common example that folks know is post-payment audit. So for those of you who don't know revenue cycle, as a physician, I see the patient, I deliver the care, and I send in a claim. Occasionally, the payer will say, we're randomly checking and saying your documentation on this visit. Please send us your clinical note, or some other reason. And right now, a lot of it is in documentation requests via various methods, and it's very time-consuming and slow. So what we developed in the clinical data exchange is a set of use cases where you can do a request, either from payer to provider or provider to provider, using communication request. And the idea here is, the FHIR stalwarts in here will say, well, just do a GET. Well, the GET, there is a history, but it doesn't give you a lot of context. So by packaging the request in a communication request, you can give context for why you need it. And you can, it supports doing documents like CDA, so you can actually put into the request a LOINC code for what kind of document, whether it's a clinical note or a progress note or a discharge summary. Or you can put in specific FHIR queries. So find me an observation between a certain date with a given LOINC code for the code. And in our examples, we have a handful of how you would generate that. And you put these queries, valid FHIR queries, into your communication request. You send it over to the provider. Ideally, in a future state, it's all done synchronously. You get a response back. But today, in our example, we show how this is a user on the provider side might look through this and say, yeah, I can confirm that I have this data. I can look at it in advance before I send it. And then when it's done, I send a communication resource back to the payer because I knew who the request came from. And then the payer can manage it on their end. So we think this is beneficial for lots of different reasons. And we're continuing to expand these. We talked about the payer data exchange, so sending information from payers to providers to improve patient care and information. And we have a couple of sub-use cases that we've put into this bucket because it's payer information, including, I'll come back to that, formularies and directories. So another use case that we've just started a couple of weeks ago is around alerts and notifications. In the NPRM, there is a understanding that we want to be able to have admit and discharge notifications sent to the care team. And so we did some initial work on scoping this, like who's in the care team. I think we concluded the payer very well could be in the care team, so that they fit. And one other thing we recognize is that there's a notification, and then there's the response. This work focuses just on the notification. You broadcast it to the people or the entities that subscribe to that notification. How they respond to it is up to them in terms of priority and their own workflow. And so we're going to be coordinating with what the folks are doing, and Josh Mandel is doing with Argonaut around the subscription model, so we can define what are the events. We want to at least have admit and discharge, but we think it's a reusable artifact that we could define other events. As a physician, I worry a little bit about alert fatigue and how much you send out, but I think that'll be defined ultimately in implementation. But if you can define, so there are other things where providers might want to know, I ordered something for the patient, did it get completed before I get a report? So there are all kinds of things you can do around alerts and notifications. And so this is just a high-level diagram, so you can subscribe to a notification. And this is not nearly complete, but it's just a high-level representation. So this is an interesting one that we're just early in the discussions around patient cost transparency. The idea here is there's been a fair amount in the news about surprise billing and patients not realizing that they agreed to something and had no idea how much it was going to cost. I know NPR does this thing with Kaiser Health News about let's take a deeper look at your bill and try to tease it out. And so this has been a concern for this administration, and it's pretty much bipartisan, that patients want to have a better sense of how much things cost. But I didn't realize until we had this conversation in Jacksonville with payers how really complicated this is, because there are prices that providers charge, there's in-network, there's negotiated prices, there's adjustments, how much the patient owes, And there are many factors that go into that final number. And one of the things we realize is the more clarity and definition you have in the inputs, like something as simple as a medication or durable medical equipment or a specific provider, the more specific you can be with, we're not even calling it the actual price, we're looking at the estimate. What's the range of that estimate? Because some durable medical equipment can be really clear, but if you're going in for exploratory surgery, who knows, right? And so that's one of the themes that came out. And so we're continuing to kind of flesh out the scope of this because I think it's actually going to be more complicated than originally thought. So this is another interesting one, payer coverage decision exchange. This has also been ramped up. The idea here is that patients move from payer to payer all the time. Hopefully less frequently in the future, but still a fair amount. And one of the big challenges and problems that patients and providers feel is, I have a chronic condition or a condition that I got prior authorization approved for a certain service or medication or whatever, and when I go to a new payer, I got to do it all over again. It's a burden on the patient, it's a burden on the provider, and it runs the risk of a patient having some gap in the services that they receive. So the idea here is, how do we improve this by providing the information from payer A around services that were authorized for the patient and sending it to payer B. And it could be, let's say, if you were on some, let's say, rheumatoid therapy. We know that payers use certain rule sets, either Interqual or MCG or others, to help them define medical necessity. If you knew, if payer A used MCG version 1.0.1 of some guideline, and they knew all the input of that data, and then the clinical information that happened after that was authorized, and was able to send that over to the new payer. The new payer, it doesn't guarantee that the new payer says you're covered, but it provides them way more information than they would have before, and it reduces the burden on the provider who's delivering the care to have to regather all that information and send it back. And so we think there's a lot of value here too for patients and providers. So this is kind of a high level. It could be some of these use cases look at member authorization to do this, and I think there's some of these the guidelines around that are being fleshed out. But you can envision that you could have member-mediated information exchange, just like kind of what we do with third-party apps today. So it would use that kind of same framework. We talked about gaps in care. The big challenges that we discovered in gaps in care not is defining things similar to how you do quality measures, but we recognize that there's a gap in care at a patient level, the patient in front of me, and as either a primary care provider or a specialist. And then there are gaps in care on a population of patients that my hospital system, my group, is responsible for. And what we've worked out so far is some workflow and feedback loops for how you would deliver a set of gaps in care to a system that wants to do population level management, and how you would deliver that information at a specific patient level, and recognizing that there are a lot of authorities that define gaps, whether it's the U.S. Preventive Medicine Task Force, whether it's CMS or CDC or any number of folks. And so how do you trickle it down? How do we build a framework so that when you get down to a specific patient, you know that these are the gaps, and not only that they have an open gap, but what gaps are closed, and then potentially what gaps are due in the next 30 days. So we want to be able to build the framework so that you can do visualizations however it works best for the providers. So I'm down. So this is what we're looking at for the rest of this year. We have a whole bunch of ballots going through QA right now for an early September ballot. And the reason why we're doing an early September ballot is that we were trying to, Da Vinci has put a significant workload on the HL7, and we were trying to figure out how to even that out a little bit more. And so we're putting some of our work into early ballot and then pushing some things to September ballot. And part of this is recognizing that the NPRM is out, but we don't actually know when they're going to do implementation. There are different camps who want it done early. Other camps think that it's not feasible and it should be pushed. But we want to have something started if it were to stay on a January timeline. So this is our HL7 Confluence site. I encourage you, it's confluence.hl7.org. It's a public website. We do recommend you sign up and get an account. And you click the button for Join Da Vinci Listserv. And so we send out information about our meetings, about public webinars, general updates. And if we have on the left here all our use cases, you can actually look at our use case artifacts. If you want a simple place to find all our meetings, you can find it here as well as the HL7 Conference Call Center. So you can sign up for meetings there. So this is a great place to find kind of all things Da Vinci. So I'll hang on for questions. Thank you. And there's 2 minutes left. Questions?
Viet.
Yes.
General question. How many use cases do you consider to be Da Vinci use cases? I mean, we started with 4, scheduling, PDX, contract, and this. But now it's kind of the number is growing.
Yes.
And people sometimes asking me as a vendor, how many that are available in general? What are canonic Da Vinci use cases?
So these are all of our use cases. These 17. These are all Da Vinci. Da Vinci sponsored.
17?
Yeah.
Da Vinci use cases.
As of today.
Okay, because there are, people come to connectathons, there are more use cases.
Oh yes, there are definitely more.
Ones are Da Vinci,
Right.
Da Vinci not. So this slide
Yes.
actually explains
Yes.
it.
And we list them on the Connectathon webpage so that, and we're taking over a corner and enlarging. We had a Connectathon in Jacksonville. We had over 110 participants, which is pretty significant for a smaller group to do a Connectathon. So it was pretty sick. Yes, sir.
How's the industry support for CQL going?
Well, we're definitely pushing it in terms of CQL within quality measures, as well as CQL in the the documentation templates. I think there's general support by the EHRs. I can't speak for any of them specifically, but it's going to be a significant part of moving forward for those 2 use cases because we want to represent things in a shareable way. And I don't know that there's a better method. If there are, tell me afterwards, to make these shareable algorithms for retrieving data or representing quality measures. So, but the challenge I see is that we're still relatively early stages of CQL and there's still a lot of lessons learned. So we have CMS's CCSQ with their quality folks are working on converting ECQMs to FHIR measure resources. And so they're learning some of the pitfalls. And so at some point, I would imagine in the next year or so, as they've gone through their fairly long list, we'll have best practices defined. There's still some need for a tool chain. And so once we get all that, I think we can then start reaching out to the broader measure authority community and get them more involved. But I know the payers are working on it too. Yes, sir.
So for some of these use cases, what's the next step through maturity? Like I'm looking at gaps in care and prior authorization, and it sounds like there's synergy within the real-time benefit check, and then also CDC's, the CPG's, the clinical program guidelines. So
I'm not familiar.
as far as like prior auths, if you look at digital data and you realize that 90% are auto-approved, was it really a prior auth or just a clinical guideline? So how does this move forward?
So it moves forward in the same way I'm going to give you a generic answer, all HL7 implementation guides do, which is we do what work we know in the community as we start. We publish the implementation guide, we create the reference implementation, we ballot it, we get that feedback, we incorporate and we keep turning doing the cycles, because we have to get to the point where organizations are comfortable enough to do a pilot implementation. And we actually do have Da Vinci members. Cambia in particular announced they were going to do a pilot with Multicare and OHSU here in the Pacific Northwest. So we have to get to the point where implementers feel like the implementation guides are clear enough that they're willing to try the pilots. And then we just do the iterations to mature the implementation guides. All right, well, thank you. I'll be happy to stick around outside. Or actually, we're at lunch, so enjoy lunch.